afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Strictly History. I'm Katie.
I'm Allison.
And today we're going to be doing something a little different. Today we are going to be talking about the history of banned books because this week is Banned Books Week. We'll be looking at banned books in a wide historical context. I'll be looking at the earliest events of banned books, or of like leaders banning books in their sovereign nation, their kingdoms, because banning books is not something that is just new. It's not something that has just popped up from within the last several years. It's been going on since people started writing hieroglyphics on papyrus. It's been going on a really long time. And then when I'm done with that, Allison will be kind enough to talk more about what happened in the mid 20th century because it parallels really what's going on now. So, okay, I will get started. So, our earliest indication of banned books happened between 259 and 210 BC. The Chinese emperor, and I apologize for mispronouncing names, I'm terrible at it, but I will do my best. Shi Huan Tai is said to have buried alive 460 Confucian scholars to control the writing of history in his name. In 212 BC, he burned all of the books in his kingdom, retaining only a single copy of each for the royal library, and those were destroyed before his death. With all previous historical records destroyed, he thought history could be said to begin with him. So here we see an example of book banning being done in ancient China, in another part of the world. It is not, the practice of book banning is not unique to the United States. It happens all over the world. And this Chinese emperor thought he could rewrite history in a way that would make him seem far more important than he probably actually was.
Yeah, that seems to be a common trend. Mm-hmm. The historical aspect of wanting to control what people thought of the past, the way the past is taught.
Yeah, and it's like almost propaganda. I would say that book banning in like the medieval era was more towards religious control because it was done mostly by by churches in that time period.
Yeah, I don't know if you found, but that seems to be the earliest book challenges, book banning in the United States during the colonial era. So before the United States was religious.
Right, was even the United States. And then we have AD 8. It's AD. And then the number 8, not 88. The Roman poet Ovid was banished from Rome for writing, it's Latin, so again, bear with me, Ars Amatoria, the art of love. He died in exile in Greece 8 years later. All Ovid's works were burned by Savonarola in Florence in 1497, and an English translation of The Art of Love was banned by U.S. Customs in 1928. So that's interesting. We're going to hear more about Savonarola. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. I'm trying my best, but he was a monk in Italy during the Renaissance period in Florence. It was before Italy was actually Italy. And he was very pious and saw that, and felt that the writers of Renaissance Italy and the artists of Renaissance Italy was polluting the morality of Florence citizens during the time. So he somehow influenced many people to burn works of art and burn writers' works, poets. I don't know that they would necessarily call novels of the time, but burn novels that were written that he deemed immoral. So it's a very extreme time in Renaissance Italy for book banning. Mm-hmm. They actually burned books. In 35 AD, the Roman Emperor Caligula, such a fun person.
That sounds right.
Oh, yeah. Opposed the reading of the Odyssey by Homer, written more than 300 years before. He thought the epic poem was dangerous because it expressed Greek ideas of freedom. So here we see another emperor trying to oppress a group of people, the Greeks, ancient Greeks, from expressing ideas of freedom. Though I've read the Odyssey, and I don't see how he could conclude the epic poem for Greek freedom, because at this point also the Roman emperor has already conquered Greece.
Yeah.
Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, which is a Greek island, but yeah, I don't see how Caligula could have drawn that conclusion. But Caligula, as a person, was insane. So
probably just afraid that that Odysseus was just too cool.
Probably.
It would inspire too many people.
Probably, if you could, if you were able to read if you were able to actually read the poem in the time. So
yeah, he could have been reading into one small part. That doesn't stand out to you that much.
That's true.
I haven't read it in a long time, so nothing jumps out at me.
Yeah, no, granted, it also has been a long time for me as well. So nothing really jumps out except for, when Odysseus returns to Ithaca and Penelope has all of these suitors, and he retakes, his kingdom and Penelope and, chases the suitors away. So, that could be seen as imposing Greek freedom, the idea, not imposing, but the idea of Greek freedom from the Roman Empire.
Yeah,
I guess. I don't know if that's a stretch.
Good.
So in 640, according to the legend of the Caliph Omar, burned all 200,000 volumes in the library at Alexandria in Egypt. In doing so, he said, if these writings of the Greeks agree with the book of God, they are useless and need not be preserved. If they disagree, they are pernicious, I think I'm saying that correctly, and ought to be destroyed. In burning these books, the Caliph provided 6 months' fuel to warm the city's baths. So we're starting to see now the book banning in terms of, or book burning, which is essentially the same thing, in my mind anyway, as a means of quelling what the leaders would have seen as a religious heresy. This is I think the earliest documentation we have of book burning within that context. Then in 1497 to 1498, here's the monk I was talking about earlier, Savonarola. I apologize again. It's not something that I practice, and I probably should have. A Florentine religious fanatic with a large following, was one of the most notorious and powerful of all censors. In these years, he instigated great bonfires of the vanities, which destroyed books and paintings by some of the greatest artists of Florence. He persuaded the artists themselves to bring their works, including drawings of nudes, to the bonfires. Some poets decided they should no longer write in verse because they were persuaded that their lines were wicked and impure. Popular songs were denounced, and some were turned into hymns with new pious lyrics. Ironically, in May of 1498, another great bonfire was lit, this time under Savonarola, who hung from a cross. With him were burned all his writings, sermons, essays, and pamphlets. So this monk must have been charismatic enough to persuade artists of their own works, poets of their own poetry, to burn their own creations because he felt that they were impure and immoral. And I find it very ironic that something must have happened. I think, because I know I've read about this particular monk when I was in Binghamton, and it was for a class I was taking. It was a Renaissance Colloquium class, and I don't remember what happened. I think he got overzealous, and I think he did end up being burned at the stake. I didn't realize, though, it was with his own writings, which was probably prevalent.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah. I also find it interesting as well that one of the quests in Assassin's Creed 2, where when you play as Ezio and you're in Renaissance Italy. This is a video game. It's a historic video game. It's a video game based in historic events. Joe's laughing. He knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Funniest boss fights ever. You just punch Rodrigo Borgia.
Yeah.
It's all. You just go up to the Pope and fist fight him.
Yeah.
Who can beat that?
I don't think anybody. But in one of these quests, you confront. You're confronted with what was happening with Savonarola and what he was doing, and you have to essentially assassinate the people that are instigating these bonfires to happen because they have been put under his influence, but with help from the Piece of Eden, which is this. I'm getting sidetracked, but at the end of this quest, he's burned at the stake, as it is in history. So I find it interesting that that's also being reflected within modern culture. Yeah. As it were. It's a really fun video game. If you haven't played it, you should play it.
I haven't played it.
You should play it. It's one of my favorites. What about you, Joe?
It played a lot of that back in the day.
Yeah.
So many great moments in that, such as the hug Leonardo da Vinci button. So.
Yeah. So in 1524 through 1526. Thousands of copies of William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament were printed in Germany and smuggled into England, where they were publicly burned in 1526 on the orders of London's Roman Catholic bishop. Church authorities in England insisted that the Bible would be available only in Latin and that only they would be able to read and interpret it. I think that's very key, to read and interpret what is written, because it's a form of control.
Yeah.
And so is censorship. It's a form of control. In 1536, as a result of a plot masterminded by the English, Tyndale was arrested in Belgium, tried for heresy, and strangled and burned at the stake near Brussels. A few of his translations were burned with him. Today, only 3 original copies of Tyndale's New Testament survive. So here we're starting to see what I touched on earlier, was the burning of books, the censoring of books that had to do with religion and being seen as religious heresy. And Tyndale is a great example. It's like you don't touch religious books unless you are fully and completely aware of the fact that this could get you in a lot of trouble, especially in what is now medieval Europe. Because of the fact that bishops and priests knew Latin, knew how to read Latin, they could essentially control the congregation, who was ever there. And a lot of people that went to church of the time was the rulers of whatever kingdom that they were performing the sermons in. And so if you're able to control essentially the head of state, then you can control the society of the kingdom as a whole. So this is where people get into a lot of trouble for translating like the Old Testament to English. It's actually the New Testament to English. But it's that thought of making holy books available to everybody that the church of the time did not want to happen at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about maintaining influence over the ideas people have. Mm-hmm. So if they can read it themselves, then they can think for themselves.
Right, exactly. And they can interpret it themselves. They don't need a bishop or a priest or a monk to interpret what is being said to them. And that frightened the church of the time. In 1559, for hundreds of years, the Roman Catholic Church listed books that were prohibited to its members. But in this year, Pope Paul IV established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum for more than 400 years. 400 years. This was the definitive list of books that Roman Catholics were told not to read. It was one of the most powerful censorship tools in the world. 400 years.
It's a very long time.
Yeah, it's insane. But that also just goes to show how powerful the Roman Catholic Church was in medieval Europe and medieval Great Britain. It's insane. 1597, the original version of Shakespeare's Richard II contained a scene in which the king was deposed from his throne.
Problem.
Mm-hmm. Queen Elizabeth I was so angry that she ordered the scene removed from all copies of the play. So even Queen Elizabeth was not, against censorship. And so she censored William Shakespeare. Of all playwrights she could censor, she censored him because he showed Richard the Second. I almost said first. Richard II from he depicted Richard II being deposed from the throne. I'm sorry, I'm getting angry. Not angry, I'm getting obsessed, so my thoughts are not catching up to the rest of me. 1614, Sir Walter Raleigh's book, The History of the World, was banned by King James I of England for being too saucy and censoring princes. So here we see more of a governmental issue, because princes, meaning king, meaning royalty, at this point is still, the concept of absolute rule is still very much within consciousness here. The concept of a constitutional monarchy doesn't happen until after the Glorious Revolution, and at least in England. I find England to be very unique from the rest of Europe in that they had a constitutional monarchy so much more early than the rest of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm not surprised that this happened in that time because of this, the absolute monarchy mentality. Yeah. 1624, Martin Luther's German translation of the Bible was burnt in Germany by order of the Pope. This should be a no-brainer. Martin Luther is essentially the father of Protestantism. It goes against the Roman Catholic Church, no one that was of the Roman Catholic faith liked that this monk in Germany did this. It divided so many different people in Europe and in Great Britain. The St. Bartholomew Days massacre in France is, I think, the most pivotal massacre between Catholics and Protestants, because French Catholics murdered whole French Huguenots, Protestants, in the streets of Paris, and it was atrocious. It was atrocious.
Yeah, that's one word for it.
Yeah. 1616 to 1642, Galileo. We all know who Galileo is and what happened to him.
Yeah.
Again, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. Galileo's theories about the solar system and his support of the discoveries of Copernicus were condemned by the Catholic Church. Under threat of torture and sentenced to jail at the age of 70, the great scientist was forced to renounce what he knew to be true. On his death, his widow agreed to destroy some of his manuscripts, which is really sad.
Yeah.
And a great loss to, I think, the scientific community as well as the historic one.
Yeah, it's tragic when the actual ideas are lost.
Yeah.
More than them just being challenged. It's
Right.
just gone forever.
Yeah, yeah. 1720. So now we're getting further away from the medieval period. So we're going to see book banning and censorship change away from more of the religious heresy and the narcissism of rulers in the ancient world, to more of a there's still ideology with it, but I think we're going to start seeing more of a political motive with book banning. So 1720, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe was placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorium by the Spanish Catholic Church. And I don't have much information on why that was, because I've never read Robinson Crusoe. I only know Robinson Crusoe from Rocky and Bullwinkle. and the Robinson Crusoe show that was on NBC many, many, many years ago. So I don't know why the Spanish Catholic Church would have wanted to ban Robinson Crusoe from being read.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Joe?
I've got nothing. But I know at some point, Louis Buñuel, who's like a famous surrealist and very political artist and filmmaker, he directed an adaptation of Robinson Crusoe, which is very out of his wheelhouse. But I wonder, he is Spanish, I wonder if perhaps that sort of banning is what drew him to it, or if perhaps there are themes in it that sort of relate to that. But
interesting.
Yeah, I've never read the book myself. I always just thought of it as an old-timey adventure story. So.
Yeah. Cool. So, there's a lot more of book banning within the 19th century. From 1864 to 1959, Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables was placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorium. And that, Les Miserables is just about revolution in France within the 1800s, the mid-1800s. And I think that the reason why it was placed on the index is because it talked about going against your government and revolution.
Yeah.
And it's France. So
Yeah, basically anything that would give people ideas on rising up against the government and questioning their authority.
Yeah.
Were big problems.
Yeah, especially, I think more so back then than now, only because we have the right to do so. And you're going to get opposition from expressing ideas that are different from others. But I think back then, people in government, whether that was a kingdom or a constitutional monarchy, they had more of an authority, I guess, if that's like I can't think of a better term than that. They were able to exert more of their authority, I think is the better way to go. To either burn these books, persecute the people who wrote them, handed them out, translated them, what have you. It was far more easier to do so. So there's other examples of past book bannings. There's too many to really get into. But what I think is interesting, just like as the last bit of note, or I should say the last bit of information from like the 19th century, before we get into the 20th century, and Allison talks about what was going on there, because at least in the 90s and 80s, we see a parallel to and 70s.
Yeah.
We see a parallel of what's going on now with book banning.
Yeah, it's very recognizable.
Right. So I'm going to give a little bit more, just one more tidbit of information, and we'll move on. In 1885, a year after the publication of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, the Library of Concord, Massachusetts decided to exclude the book from its collection. The committee making the decision said the book was rough, coarse, and inelegant, dealing with a series of experiences not elevating, the whole book being more suited to slums than to intelligent, respectable people. By 1907, it was said that Twain's novel had been thrown out of some libraries somewhere every year, mostly because its hero was said to present a bad example for impressionable young readers. Which, Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, they both have been the most, I think, banned or challenged books on school book lists, because they show a side of American society that I think a lot of people would rather forget, but I really think it's a detriment to younger generations to augment these books, because showing that side of American history is just as important, I think, as well as showing the good that happened in American history. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. I think it's always worth at least a conversation about those things.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Joe? You didn't hear what I said, did you?
No comment.
Okay. So we're now getting into the mid-20th, early 21st century. And as I said earlier, we see a parallel within the 70s, 80s, and 90s of book banning with what's going on now. And I just think it's interesting that the fact that it shows that history repeats itself, when many people say that history doesn't repeat itself, which is a load of crock, because it always repeats itself, because no one learns from the mistakes of the past. So,
So I mostly focused on like the 70s and 80s, because that's, when most of this took place. Not to say that there wasn't book banning in the United States before or after those decades, but considering the first banned books week was in 1982, that has to show, this was a big problem in that decade. But we can work our way a bit more up to the 1960s and 70s. I don't know how much you know about like the Comstock laws?
No.
So they were passed in, I think it was 1873, and they basically banned possession or sending through the mail any information that was seen as immoral or obscene.
Okay.
And it really targeted information about like birth control, or you couldn't send like pornography through the mail.
Right.
And I don't know what year they were repealed, but you know, they were passed in 1873. They had a long history up until the early 20th century. So I thought that was worth, you know, mentioning.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I
feel like I did read about that when I was doing research on banned books in history, and I feel like that act was still enacted in the 1920s.
Yeah, it was a pretty long time.
Yeah.
And then getting into the 1920s and 1930s, once the civil rights movement starts to gain more steam, and once, you know, in the 1930s particularly, there's a big conversation about, you know, the aftermath of the Civil War. And, you know, there's groups like, I think it's the Daughters of the Confederacy. I might be saying the name wrong. But they didn't necessarily agree with the way historically the Civil War was being taught.
Oh,
you know,
I know about them. You were
Yeah.
right. It is the Daughters of the Confederacy, and it's the Lost Cause movement, where they still make Confederate flags. They still do tea parties. I mean, like, they host they reenact Confederate battles that were victorious. Yeah, so it's what's known as the Lost Cause movement.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's around then when groups are looking at how the Civil War is being taught in Southern schools and how sympathetic or unsympathetic it's being towards their cause. You know, they have problems with that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see.
You're doing great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so the 60s and the 70s are definitely known as a time where there's a lot of social progress, a lot of social change. And, you know, in the 70s particularly, the women's rights movement gains a lot of steam. That's when, you know, Roe v. Wade happens 1973, Title IX's passed 1972. The Equal Rights Amendment is passed by both houses of Congress in 1972. So, you know, there's a lot going on there. There's continued civil rights movement into the 70s, from the 60s, from the 50s.
Yeah.
Schools are becoming more secular. You know, Engel v. Vitale was passed 1962, which I don't know how much you know about that.
No, I don't. Please.
So it made it so that it was unconstitutional for states to require prayer in public schools.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So just like things like that, showing a lot of things are changing in the country, and, you know, when there's a lot of social change, people aren't always going to agree with those things.
Right.
So, you know, groups form in opposition to those things. Like in 1979, the Moral Majority forms. They say it's in opposition to Roe v. Wade. There seems to be evidence to imply that it could be also about elimination of segregation and civil rights. But, you know, that's a whole conversation.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also groups like the Eagle Forum, formed by, I never know how to say her last name, Phyllis Schlafly. And she was a big opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's all, you know, connected there.
Is she the woman that said that if I were tea and you steeped me for a long time or something to that effect, that I would be stronger or something? She was an opponent of, I'm probably thinking of somebody else.
I'm not sure, but she was like the opponent.
Yeah.
So you've probably heard of her if you've seen anything about the Equal Rights Amendment. I think she usually comes into the conversation.
Yeah.
Because she had a big hand in why it ultimately wasn't passed by the states. Because it is strange when you see it was passed by both houses of Congress.
Yeah.
And then 10 years go on and it's just never passed. It's never ratified by the states. Wow. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think she was portrayed by Cate Blanchett in a series, I think on Hulu, for about the women's movement of that era. I don't remember what it was called.
called Mrs. America or something to that effect.
Probably. That sounds right, but I don't remember. Yeah. So I know of her. I also know that she was pied in the face at a I think a board meeting or a televised meeting or something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that, but
yeah.
But she was definitely influential.
Mm-hmm.
So then, anytime there's a concern that, the country's losing its morality and it going against the way you think the country, should be going societally, these groups take up that cause. And in one way they're doing that is questioning and bringing into, how do I want to say this?
They're challenging and sometimes ultimately banning books that they do not agree with what the authors are writing about.
Yeah, especially in terms of what children are being taught.
Right.
So it's not as much, in the past it would be like religious, what people are seeing, what like commoners are seeing.
Right.
More so now it would be what children are being exposed to in school and public libraries.
So it's mostly now turning towards parental rights.
Yes.
Being allowed to control what your child can read or not read, which I would like to say we are all for. You have every right to say what your child can and cannot read, but you cannot force that opinion onto other parents. That's what is not right. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, so let's see. So according to the ALA, in the 70s, there were books that were being challenged because they had sexist or racist content. But that seems to go down the closer you get to the 80s. And the closer you get to the 80s, more books are being reported based on obscene material, politics, and also like societal implications.
Right. Do you see a rise in I was just curious about this, and if you don't have the answer, that's okay too. But do you see a rise of book banning coincide with the rise of HIV and AIDS in America during the 80s, or am I just like?
I'm not sure the exact timeline in regards to when exactly in the 80s did the AIDS crisis become apparent. I'm not sure the exact timeline, because it seems like 1982 is around the time that book banning became like the most challenges that they were seeing.
Okay, and I think the AIDS epidemic became more prevalent in the later 80s.
Yeah.
The mid to late 80s. So I was just curious if that had any driving force as well.
Yeah. I mean, there could be something there. I just didn't see that much of it.
Yeah.
It was sometimes harder to find, because I was trying to read more what they were saying at the time.
Right.
There was only so many articles you could find from the time.
Yeah.
And it was very hard to find anything from the late 80s to the 90s. Most of the stuff was the late 70s to the early 80s.
Right, and which you had already indicated that a lot of social change and upheaval was going on in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically it seems like, according to the ALA, in the early 70s there were only usually about 100 challenges a year. And that wouldn't be 100 different books. It would just be 100 challenges. It could be the same book. By the late 70s, there's usually around like 300. So it's going up, not crazy. And then 1980, 300 cases. By the next year, 1981, there's about 900 cases.
Wow.
1982, there's around 1,000. So, that's a pretty big increase.
That's a huge jump.
Yeah.
A huge jump in book banning and challenges.
Yeah, so basically, like, these groups, like the Moral Majority and the Eagle Forum, would circulate newsletters and different lists to people in those groups or people who are interested in those causes. And they would list books that they think are concerning or that people might want to, question their school districts about or see if they're in their public libraries. So it's pretty different than how you would get information now, but that's, what they would do then. And it was pretty effective, the information would spread.
Right.
I think one of the things I was most interested to see, and I don't know if you would agree, because we talked about this a little before. So in 1982, there was a ruling on a court case, Island Trees Union Free School District v. Pico. And it was basically that in the mid-70s, there was a school district in Long Island that removed books from the shelves. And it happened after, I believe it was the school district president, he went to a meeting with a conservative group called the Parents of New York United, and they had a list of objectionable books. So then when he went back to his school district, he went and he looked in the library, found some of the books on the list. They pulled them off the shelves, and then I believe they had a commission review the books over the course of a year to make recommendations whether or not those books, if they should go on the shelves, that there should be some sort of parental permission required to read them, or if they should just be banned altogether. I think the school district didn't listen to the commission's recommendations, and I think they ended up only putting 2 books back on the shelf when that's not what the commission recommended. And then a group of students ended up suing the school.
Interesting.
Yeah, arguing that removing the books violated their First Amendment rights. As it does over the course of a few years, it gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules that the constitutionality of book challenges depends on the motivation behind why you're challenging the book. And you can't just remove a book because you don't agree with the content or if there's some sort of political reason behind why you're removing them. And in this case, when they first removed the books, they made it pretty clear that it was political reasons and just that they didn't agree, the way some topics were treated in the books. So when I was reading this, I was like, oh, it's interesting. It seems like, the question has already been answered. So how are we seeing all of these book challenges now when there was a Supreme Court case on it? And it's because you can't remove books for those reasons, but if you can make the argument that the books are vulgar or they're unsuitable for education, then you can still challenge those books.
Interesting.
So it didn't answer all of the questions that, people have. It's not
a definitive answer. Because there's still a way for parents to be objectionable about a book because they don't like a particular scene and it doesn't really pertain to the book as a whole. Most oftentimes it seems people were challenging books based on a few moments in the books, not the book as a whole. Which is probably something you'll see today too. Absolutely. Well, I think a really good example is the court case that was going on down in Virginia, that a former candidate for Congress down in Virginia had sued Barnes & Noble for having a Court of Mist and Fury on the shelf near where minors could foreseeably grab the book and start looking through it because of one scene of 2 consenting adults for lack of a better term, consummating their relationship, again, for lack of a better term, and they were arguing, he and his lawyer were arguing that it violates the obscenity law in Virginia. Luckily, the judge ruled that it didn't, and they lost the lawsuit. Of course they're going to appeal. but the judge not automatically, but the judge ruled that it wasn't part of the obscenity law. And the obscenity law, essentially, paraphrasing, in a nutshell, it's like any book that's like its only existence is to be like pornographic, or it doesn't pertain to like the literature of I wish I knew better how to explain it, but the scene in which the book depicts wasn't the whole book. It was one scene in the middle of the book, towards the end, not the beginning, and they were calling it, saying that it violated the obscenity law of Virginia, of which it did not.
Yeah.
So it was a good ruling for book readers.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, too, in like the 70s and 80s, they were passing laws in states that would prohibit public displays of books that would contain sexually explicit material in the case that minors would happen upon them.
Right.
There was a case in Georgia, the law was struck down, but there's other laws similar that weren't, which is, difficult, because then that is, in bookstores,
Yeah. I mean, I find it interesting that the former candidate to Congress had gone after Barnes and Noble, because I know in my local Barnes and Noble, the A Court of Thorns and Roses, that entire series, is in the adult fantasy section, where if a child was to go, it's like on the opposite, like in the total opposite direction of the children's section of the bookstore. So I mean, a parent would have had to gone with the child into that section. So I mean, I really feel like too, it's the parents' responsibility to keep an eye on your children when you're in a public space that sells books of varying age ranges and varying genres and all this other stuff, because it's ultimately their responsibility and not the store's responsibility. You know where I'm going with this. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult when it becomes the thing versus what can you do to ban things in public places and private stores.
Right.
Versus school, because it's very different.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And it seems like, according to the ALA in the 70s and 80s, most of the books being targeted in schools were usually nonfiction titles about politics, science, history, in addition to like the fiction titles.
Right.
Yeah, and I was reading, even this morning, I was reading about the efforts at the time to ban certain textbooks.
That somehow does not surprise me in the least.
Yeah, and there was this couple in Texas that were very, very successful.
Really?
Yeah, because apparently, I don't know what it would be now, but which would make sense because Texas is a big state.
Yeah.
So Texas was the biggest market for textbooks. So if you can control that market, you can really control most of the country, because textbook companies don't want to be blacklisted or banned from the biggest market they have in Texas.
Right.
So,
do you recall what the reason was for banning for getting the textbook banned?
Well, I know one example that they gave, that a success that they had, was that they were able to make it so that the textbook companies, if there was like a chapter on evolution, that they would have to put like a disclaimer saying that it's evolution is a theory, not a fact. So things like that, they would take issue with, different scientific theories.
Yeah.
They couldn't discuss things that might cause, I think they said, an embarrassment in the classroom. So probably, things about anatomy they might not be able to talk about. And I think there still is the way American history should be taught, and
Wow.
That's
Just
even
wow.
a thing now.
Yeah.
How do you look at history and what things do you take from it? It's very controversial. But yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
That is interesting.
Because they would argue that it's not censorship because they're not necessarily censoring the individual textbooks, but they're picking and choosing which textbooks to put in the school, saying, why wouldn't you pick the best one?
Right. But in a way that is censorship. I mean, you can dress it up as any way as you want to with picking like the best textbook, but if you're omitting things that are regardless of whether or not evolution's a theory, it's still been scientifically proven to some extent that evolution actually happened. And if you're consciously omitting it, that's censorship.
Yeah. I think it's like regardless of how you go about it, you're still trying to influence what students are taught and the way they're going to think about it.
Right.
So.
Right.
It's censorship in some form.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that was it.
No more. So I think, like, just for like final thoughts, really, historically speaking, banned books have been more from an ideological standpoint. It was either considered religious heresy or it was some ancient emperor, king, what have you, trying to control the society that they were ruling. But as time progressed, we see more of a political motive. It's more of a political motivator than anything else that we've seen before. And where I agree that parents have a right to say, parents have a right to pick and choose what they want their children to read or not read. But there's a way to go about it. You can ask the teacher for a different book to read or to be omitted from the assignment, to do a different assignment. Where I think a line is drawn is when you put your opinion or your moral compass, again, for lack of a better term, moral compass onto other people that don't have that same opinion or have a different morality is the word I was looking for, morality than you, it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Because now you're saying that the way other parents parent is incorrect and that they should follow your opinion. And I don't think that that's right at all. And that's why I read banned books.
Yeah. And I also did just want to add, because I forgot to go into it before, but historically, banned books aren't always associated with one group over another. But in that time period, like the 60s and the 70s, there's one group more associated with book banning. It was more organized and took up the cause more than the other.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, you get banned books within both spectrums of politics, of religion. It's across the board. But as you said, in the 70s and 80s, it was far more organized and far more
say influential.
Yeah, influential. Yeah. Thank you. With one particular group.
Yes.
But it's not just that one particular group.
So not to like pick on a side here. That's just what was going on in the 70s and the early 80s.
Yep. So with that, we hope that you, our viewers, would read banned books in solidarity of Banned Book Week, and to have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.